Welcome to The Rest of the Moose,
Where's the rest of this moose?
a podcast about anything and everything.
You must have hated this moose.
Here's your host, Chris Grum.
And I am fresh back from a trip to the Big Apple, New York City. Tried to get up there as much as possible to see Broadway shows, and my trip this time was not for necessarily a great reason, but it turned out to allow me a little time in the city. For those that don't know, my Uncle Alan, who retired as a one-star general, was in Korea, Vietnam, and taught at West Point, was a graduate at the top of his class at West Point back in the 50s. He passed away back in October. And, of course, as you know, with the Army and with the government, anytime you ask for anything, it takes an eternity to get it done. But we wanted him interred at West Point. And we actually were able to attend that ceremony a couple of weeks ago. It really was, if you've never been to a military funeral, boy, funerals put a tear in your eye in the first place, but the patriotism swells to just another level. Patriotism. I think I said patriotism, but anyway, I think you know what I mean. It really was a spectacular send-off for the general, but it allowed me to have an extra couple of days in New York City. And so, as I always try to do when I'm anywhere near the Big Apple, I scheduled some Broadway shows. And I'm going to talk about all three of them today, and there will be some minor spoilers here and there. So if you want to go in cold to these shows, this is probably not the podcast to listen to. But I'll try not to spoil too much along the way without revealing the entire plot. But we saw three shows, all of which I was really thrilled about. And I'm going to start with the one that probably nobody's heard of, and it's called Maybe Happy Ending. And yeah, you look at the title and you go, well, that's just kind of awkward to begin with. Well, it started in South Korea, and that would be a whole different musical in North Korea, wouldn't it? But probably wouldn't be a happy ending either. But Maybe Happy Ending started over in South Korea, stop it, and has then moved across the Atlantic onto Broadway. And it was one of those shows that it's the little engine that could, for lack of a better term. Every once in a while, I try to stay plugged into the Broadway community and the theater community to find out, okay, we're opening all these big shows, but which ones are the really special ones? And the ones that can't miss. And a couple of seasons ago, that little sleeper show was Kimberly Akimbo. And I bought tickets for that, and we went into that, and not knowing a lot about it, we're just blown away. And then, of course, it wins Tony Awards and becomes the darling of the season. And I was hearing rumblings that Maybe Happy Ending was going to be this year's kind of little engine that could / sleeper show that might wind up in winning Tonys. So I said, okay, we got a slot free on Saturday evening. Let's go see it. And boy, am I glad we did. So let me give you a little overview of the show. The show is set in Seoul, South Korea, in I don't even know what to call it. Basically a storage facility, but it's one-room apartments outside of Seoul where helper bots live. And a helper bot is a robot that is essentially somebody that a family can hire to be the butler, the maid, the reminder. You're basically your Siri or your you know what, I'm not going to say her name because she'll chime over here with Amazon, but those type of things, but also in human form. And so they can do pretty much anything you want them to do. And when the show first opens, we meet Oliver, who's played by Darren Criss. Those of you that have watched Glee would certainly know Darren Criss. He's also been on Broadway before. He's won a Golden Globe, won an Emmy. So he's bounced around in a bunch of different things. I saw him years ago in How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. So I was thrilled to get to see Darren again. And he plays Oliver. Now, Oliver is a HelperBot version 3, so an older version. So think like an iPhone 3. And by chance, he meets his next-door neighbor, played by Helen J. Shin, who is Claire. And Claire is a Model 5, which is the current model. And she's running out of energy and needs to borrow his charger. And that leads to a whole adventure with the two of them and explores a possible romance and then also about their memories and how their owners treated them. And it really is a fascinating way of examining the human condition through non-humans. It's just a beautiful show. The songs were fun. The staging was really, really clever. And it was just brilliantly acted to the point where Helen's character, which is Claire, is a Model 5, a newer model, and she acts almost entirely human. And so you probably wouldn't know, in a kind of a Battlestar Galactica way, if you'll allow me, for those that have watched the show, you couldn't tell the difference between her and the Cylons, if that makes sense. Oliver, on the other hand, has very almost robotic movements, and some of the things he does are extremely programmed. And I thought Darren did a phenomenal job of keeping within that character, but also being able to show the robot's humanity, for lack of a term. Anyway, I highly recommend maybe Happy Ending. It is an hour and a half long, no intermission, really brilliantly done, and a show that I think will be certainly a front runner for the Tony Award for Best New Musical. My pick certainly to win it, and I certainly could see the two of them getting nominated as well. It really is just a wonderful evening at the theater. There's a couple of tears in it, but it's mostly a musical comedy. It's very funny in places, and it is just, again, absolutely brilliantly staged. There's a moment in the show that comes out of nowhere where suddenly the orchestra is on stage with them, and it's just this beautiful sequence. The last time I remember being wowed like that, and I mean, I see a lot of staging that really blows my mind, but there's certain times where you really don't see it coming, and this was one of those. And the last time that I remember that happening was when I saw Billy Elliot for the first time, and there's a sequence where they play Swan Lake, and Billy and his older self are dancing together with a chair, and then the next thing you know, Billy, the younger Billy, is flying around the entire stage, being spun and pushed by the older Billy. And you didn't see that coming. And it was such a incredible visual. And there's a moment in this show, and maybe Happy Ending, where that happens as well. And it really was just a beautiful piece of stage magic that I thought was just absolutely outstanding. So if you're in New York, or if you catch it when it does actually go on tour, because I'm sure it will, maybe Happy Ending is absolutely worth your time. The second show that we saw was The Outsiders, based on the famous novel, and of course later made into a movie by Francis Ford Coppola and starring pretty much anybody who was anybody in the 80s as far as acting goes. The Karate Kid was in there, Tom Cruise was in there, Patrick Swayze was dirty dancing his way through Tulsa. The stage show is very, very faithful to the book and to the movie, with a couple of changes. And really, when you think about it, for a stage version, there are just certain things that you can't pull off as well on stage. And so it really makes for having to find another way to get to that plot point. But I will say that when we bought the tickets, they said on the seating chart that the front two rows were the, quote, danger zone. And if you've ever been to a Blue Man Group show, you kind of know where I'm going with this. The Outsiders features a rumble in the show that happens in the rain. And the way that they staged it, it literally rained on stage. And to allow the actors to be able to walk around and not slip on a wet, what would normally be bare stage, the entire stage was covered with little rubber pellets. And if you've ever watched a football game on artificial turf and they skid and you see little black things popping up, those are those rubber pellets that allow the water to seep through, but then also for it to be a solid, grippable surface. And so the entire stage was covered with these things. And whenever they would dance, they would slide on them or kick them up. And every once in a while, they would land on us. And by the time the show was over, and it's a 2-act show with an intermission, so 2 hours and 40 minutes-ish, my shirt pocket on my button-down shirt was almost full of these little rubber pellets. And they didn't hurt when they hit you. But the first couple of times when they would dance around us, because we were front row, you got hit by these little pellets, and after a while you just went, I'm not even going to try to wipe them off anymore. And then when it rained during the Rumble, yeah, we got wet because they kicked up some water. But it was, you know what, I thought it was an awesome experience, and I always love being that close because you can see all the emotion on the actors' faces and all that kind of stuff. And so I wouldn't trade that seat for anything. But if you are going to see The Outsiders and you don't like getting wet, or you don't like every once in a while having rubber pellets coming at you, then maybe third row or back would be a good idea for you. Now, as far as the performances go, we were lucky. We got to see almost the original cast. There was one actor who had left already. He played Dallas, if I remember correctly. So we had the understudy who did a phenomenal job, I might add. But the rest of it was the original cast, and they were all just stellar. The singing, the dancing, the music itself, which is kind of a folksy music, really played well within the story. And then the staging was very clever as well, using tires and using planks to create train at one point, and it was really just very, very cleverly done and a little bit more abstract than you might expect for a show like that, but very, very, very well done. Now, The Outsiders is coming to Houston in, I believe, November as part of the new Broadway Across America season. It's starting, appropriately enough, in Tulsa in October, I believe. And if it comes to a city near you, you definitely want to check it out, especially if you're a fan of the book, because it really is a nice, faithful adaptation. And I thought they did just a wonderful job from front to back with the entire show. Then the third show we saw, and perhaps my favorite of the three, was Sunset Boulevard. Now, Sunset Boulevard has quite the history as far as a musical goes, and I'll dive into that a little bit because I think it's kind of interesting to know how it started and then how it got to where it is today. And so the history of Sunset Boulevard, it's an Andrew Lloyd Webber show, and I'm going to get the dates on this wrong, so just don't hold me to that. But it was the early to mid-'90s when this show came out. And I want to say it was his first show after Phantom, but it might have been his second one. There might have been aspects of Love in the middle there. But it was early to mid-'90s, like 92, 93, 94, somewhere in there, that this show arrived, and it started in London. Now, you have to understand, if you've never seen the movie before, Sunset Boulevard is based on a 1960s movie that starred, oh my gosh, now I'm going to blank on their names. Gloria Swanson, who played Norma Desmond, and then, why can't I think of the man's name? I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, the movie was kind of a cult hit and still is to this day. William Holden was the male character, Joe Gillis. And anyway, the movie was kind of a hit when it came out, but it's very much a dark comedy and melodrama about Hollywood. And it's essentially about this lady named Norma Desmond, who is a faded silent film star. So she, back when the movies weren't talking, was the big star. And now the movies are talking and nobody wants her. And she's pushing 50 years old, and she really wants to be back on the big screen again where her fans have been waiting for her, as she thinks. But nobody will give her the time of day. And along comes Joe Gillis, and he's a struggling writer. He can't get a script sold in Hollywood. He wants to be the next big young thing as far as writers go, but nobody will give him the time of day. And through a chance meeting, the two of them connect. And here's Joe, who needs a job, and here's Norma, who has a script that's the size of 8 different movies, who needs somebody to kind of guide her. And they begin this kind of complicated affair, and I mean that in all the different senses of the word, that leads to tragedy. And I'm really not spoiling anything because the show in the movie begins with him floating dead in the pool, and the original Broadway version began the same way, and the current one begins with him in a body bag on the stage. So not really a spoiler as to what happens to Joe. The question is, who does it and how do we get to that point? And that's what the story of Sunset Boulevard is about. Now, getting back to the stage version of it, in the early to mid-'90s, it debuted in London with Patti LuPone in the lead role. And the idea originally was, as the story goes, that Andrew Lloyd Webber had promised Patti that she would take the show to Broadway when it got over there. Well, they had a lot of delays getting it off the ground in London. You have to understand that Norma Desmond's mansion in the movie is massive. It has all these pictures of her everywhere. This grand staircase, which figures prominently into the plot. Lounge furniture. It's just a marble terrazzo where they dance. It is just an absolutely gorgeous mansion. And when they did it on stage in London initially, the mansion was an entire set piece that could be raised and lowered from the rafters. Now, every once in a while, you see a theater do a drop where they drop a background, or they might drop in a wall, or they might drop in this, but the furniture usually rides in from the sides. Now, imagine the applause when this entire width of the stage and height of the stage mansion lowers into place, and then at one point they can raise it about halfway up, and you can see what's going on at Norma's house, while in the foreground, there's another scene going on. Just imagine the technical work behind that. And if I remember correctly, they were having trouble because at that time, cell phones were just becoming a thing. And anytime somebody would pick up a cell phone near the theater, it would trigger the automation to move. And so they delayed it a while. There was a lot of headaches getting the show off the ground. But it got off the ground in London. And while they were performing in London, Weber did a few rewrites to the script, tightened it up a bit, and he decided that instead of opening the show in New York, they would have a Los Angeles company. And back then it wasn't unheard of to do that. So they decided to open the U.S. premiere in Los Angeles. And they hired Faye Dunaway, Bonnie and Clyde, Mommy Dearest, you name the film that she was in. But they hired Faye Dunaway to play Norma Desmond. And apparently that lasted all of a week. And I'm not even sure it got that far. The reports are that, Faye always had a reputation of being difficult to work with. And then apparently that mixed with the fact that she just couldn't sing the score, from what I've read, led to basically them parting ways after a week. So when Weber had to let her go, that created a kerfuffle. And my understanding is he had to kind of pay her off to kind of make her go away. In comes Glenn Close, Oscar-winning actress, who a lot of people didn't realize had a history on Broadway before anybody saw her in Fatal Attraction or the many other movies and shows that she's done since then. I remember as a kid seeing Glenn in a production, the original, in fact, production of Barnum. That would have been 1979, 1980, 1981, somewhere in there, with Jim Dale on Broadway. And an unknown Glenn Close was up there singing and dancing and playing Charity Barnum. So they hired Glenn Close, and she obviously had some singing history and stage history, and we certainly know she can act. And so she blew it out of the water in Los Angeles. And Andrew Lloyd Webber and the producing team went, well, maybe we ought to bring this version to Broadway. In the way, of course, stood Patti LuPone. And, of course, Patti has her own reputation. I've seen her on stage many times. I've met her once or twice at the stage door. She's always been very accommodating in that regard. But she does have a bit of, let's just say, a reputation that follows her around. Whether earned or not earned, I don't know for sure, but certainly a little bit of a diva reputation. And so now Weber is saying, well, sorry, Patti, you're not taking the show to London. Instead, Glenn's going to take, or to Broadway, rather. Glenn's going to take it to Broadway. And as you might imagine, and I think she has every right to be upset by that, Patti LuPone did not react well, and here came another lawsuit. And my understanding is, and I have not read the book, I probably should, but in Patti's memoir, apparently she talks about the fact that her pool at her house is the Andrew Lloyd Webber Memorial Pool because the lawsuit paid for the pool. So anyway, you can see a storied history for a show that is already about cutthroat Hollywood, and boy, did it go through a lot of stuff behind the scenes. But Glenn opened it on Broadway. It won Best Musical. If I remember correctly, she won Best Actress. I know that George Hearn, who played Max the Butler, was Best Supporting. Phenomenal show. And I got to see it on tour with, I'm trying to think, was it Petula Clark? I think it was, when it toured the United States. But anyway, they scaled it down a bit. They toured the United States. And it was always one of my favorite Andrew Lloyd Webber scores. Then the show kind of sat dormant for a while. And I've lost track of time because of the pandemic, but I want to say just a few years back, they did a revival on Broadway, but it was a concert version with Glenn Close. And they did a little bit of movement on the stage, but it didn't have the full set. It was more of a just kind of standing at the microphones, acting out the scenes and singing the songs. And of course, that was so popular because a chance to see her do the role again. It was very, very popular, but it was a limited run of the show. And then came this version that opened in London, and I don't know the exact date of when it opened, but it opened in London, this new revival. And a guy named Jamie Lloyd is the director of the show. And his whole conceit is, let's take the show and strip it down to its most bare elements and see if the show can survive on that. And if it doesn't, obviously he doesn't put it on. But basically what he did is he took a show that was huge in spectacle and focused, and I use that word intentionally, on the characters. And so this Sunset Boulevard is literally no sets. When Norma tells Joe to have a seat, he literally sits on the floor of the stage. What they've replaced it with instead is a visual treat in the way of using lighting and in the way of using staging, and then also using handheld cameras. And so we're actually watching it being filmed, if you will, in a sense, So there are certain scenes where Norma's singing and there's an actor holding a camera and taking different angles of her, and on the back wall of the theater is her, maybe up close, just her eyes, maybe her mouth, maybe both of them. There's times where they split screen and you're looking at two different actors that are reacting to a scene that's going on. Visually, it was just absolutely stunning. And the staging of the opening number, where Joe is walking through Paramount and meeting all these different people, they're literally lined up behind him in a row. And as he meets the people, one of them will pop out next to him. At one point, he runs into three people, and there's three next to him. But by the time the number's over, that entire line has come up to him and reacted in some way. Simple, yes. But it makes you focus on the characters. And Nicole Scherzinger, who you may remember from the Pussycat Dolls, starred as Norma in London. They brought her to Broadway, and they also brought the main actors that played the main roles. So Tom Francis, who originated Joe Gillis in London, is there. Grace Hodgett Young, who plays Betty Schaefer, who works at the studio. And then Max von Merling, David Thaxton, all four of them came from London to reprise their roles on Broadway. And luckily, all four of them were in the night that I got to see the show. Now, one of the things that they've done is they've youthened the show a bit. And so Norma's not 50 anymore, because certainly Nicole doesn't look 50, and I don't know what her actual age is. I'm guessing 40. But they aged it down a little bit. And so instead of saying, I've been waiting 20 years, Joe, she says, I've been waiting many years, Joe. And there's a line where he says, nothing is wrong with looking 50 unless you're acting 20. They changed that to 40. So there's little subtle changes throughout the show. They also took out the two comedic numbers, The Ladies Paying in Act 1 and Eternal Youth in Act 2. I love both of those songs, especially The Ladies Paying, and I didn't miss it at all. And I was kind of worried about that going in because I knew they had cut it. But this is a visual treat. The show is as impactful, if not more so, than it was with the full sets. I was absolutely blown away by this show, and I want to see it again just to watch for the things that I didn't catch the first time around. And one of the things I am going to spoil, because even if you know it's coming, it is so brilliantly done that it deserves to be talked about, and that is the opening of Act 2. So I had seen a video taken from outside the theater of how they accomplished this, and it blew me away to watch them producing it, and getting to see it was thrilling. So when Act 2 begins, now understand in Act 1, you've had a video screen lower and raised at the back of the stage, and it can slant, and it can do all these different things. So you have seen them do some amazing things with their visuals already. And then Act 2 opens, and when the lights go down and the orchestra starts with the intro-act, the minute that music starts, that video screen is full stage. And the first thing you see on the camera is you're in somebody's dressing room, and they're actually watching the movie Sunset Boulevard, which is kind of cool. You go, okay, nice little meta reference there for those that recognize the film. Then the camera pulls back, and it's one of the cast members, and they wave. And then the camera works its way while the interact is playing through the different dressing rooms. And at one point, it goes into Nicole Scherzinger's dressing room, and she waves, and then they pan down, and there's a gun sitting there. Well, that plays into the plot, as you might realize. Somebody's going to off Joe. Is it her? Is it somebody else? But they just drop that little hint right there. Then we pull out of her dressing room. We work our way through the halls and down the stairs from the 6th floor to the 5th floor to the 4th floor. And we bump into different members of the ensemble doing random tasks and random things backstage as they wait to go on for Act 2. As we get to the end of the interact and we're starting the melody for what is the title song, Sunset Boulevard, and by the way, the person that's leading us is Tom Francis, who plays Joe Gillis. He's taking us through all these different places as if he's taking us through a tour backstage. But as the music starts for the title number, he goes out the door and out into the streets of New York. And he walks out under the marquee and he's singing, "Sure, I came out here to make my name, wanted my pool, my dose of fame." He's doing the song, right? And right as he hits the first Sunset Boulevard, they pan up and he's standing under the marquee for the show. So the words Sunset Boulevard are above him as he's singing the title song. Now, if that's not cool enough, he walks about a block down the street, and they've got guards. When you see the video of them doing it from the perspective of somebody watching, they have bodyguards and they have rails out in the street. They block traffic for that number. But he walks through Schubert Alley, which is between 44th and 45th Street, and there's tourists around, and they just kind of keep them at bay. But he's singing the title number. He's got an earpiece where he can hear the orchestra. We're hearing it in the theater, and we're watching him visually walk through Schubert Alley. And at one point in the song, he starts talking about Norma. And as he does that, the camera pans over to a whole row of posters for different Broadway shows. And right in the middle where he's pointing is a poster with Nicole Scherzinger as Norma Desmond, and it says Sunset Boulevard. So it is just the most clever way of staging it. Then as he works his way back to the theater, as the song is doing its final verse, the ensemble starts to appear behind him. They have been behind camera, and it's impressive how they get there without you seeing it. And then they slowly fill in from the sides and walk with him back to the theater. And as he gets to the final chorus, the side doors of the orchestra open, and in comes that whole group, and they go up on stage. And there were some people in the theater that were mumbling that it was all pre-recorded. But I'm here to tell you, I know for a fact it's done live every single night. The next night, we watched the video of him doing it from the perspective of somebody watching on the streets, and it was snowing, and he had an umbrella. And so they have a contingency for every possible scenario as far as weather and everything else. But he was walking through. It was just an incredible piece of theater to pull that off every single night. And when they tour this show, which I hope they do, they're going to have to figure out a way to do that in every city and make it to where people realize where they are. But it was such an amazing piece of staging, and the entire show was that way. And I sure hope this show makes it around the United States. It's one that's probably going to need a big star to carry it. But boy, oh boy, is it an incredible piece of theater and great storytelling on top of that. So hopefully these shows, I'm pretty sure maybe Happy Ending will tour. We already know The Outsiders is touring. Will Sunset make it to Texas and other places beyond? We'll just have to wait and see. But if you're in New York, grab tickets to see these shows. You will not be disappointed.
You've been listening to the Rest of the Moose podcast, hosted by Chris Grum.
Why don't you forget the moose for a moment?
Previous episodes are available online at chrisgrum.com. See you next time for the Rest of the Moose.